António Caetano de Abreu Freire Egas Moniz was born on the 29th of November 1874 in a small village called Avanca, in the district of Aveiro near Porto in the north of Portugal. Son of an impoverished noble rural family, from a tender age he had counted on the support of his uncle Abad, an abbot, for his education. He began primary school in his neighbouring village called Pardilho, where he earned the endearing nickname Abadinho, Little Abbot, because he was the nephew of the abbot. On his school holidays he would return to his hometown, where he would certainly show how much he had missed his parents, brother and sister. Luciana and Miguel were his playmates, and they would enjoy playing together by the lake, which was next to the home of his family, the Casa do Marinheiro, Mariner's House, an area which allowed them great depths of imagination, although the three rascals were a constant worry to their parents. But this young man didn't only live for fun, as he went on to pass his primary school with distinction. This was already a sign that this young lad would go on to have a brilliant academic future. For his uncle the abbot, education was synonymous with discipline and commitment, which led him to enroll his nephew at the Jesuit College of Saint Fiel, not far from the city of Castelo Branco. He lived up to his uncle's expectations, and over this time his good grades and merit prizes were yet further confirmation that Egas Moniz was being well educated and had good understanding. His mother, as well as his uncle, did all in their power to ensure he had an ecclesiastic upbringing. During the third year of college he was confronted with the news of the death of his sister Luciana, which was a particularly sad moment, as he had always had a soft heart for his elder sister. Lucianinha, sweet Luciana as he called her, died of tuberculosis when she was a 13-year-old student at the convent of Aroca. Coinciding with Luciana's death, the family situation in Avanca deteriorated. Along with poor agricultural years, there was a lack of business tact with his father's dealings in horses. Life began to get complicated. The debts accumulated. An opportunity arose to make a living in customs, though with less financial security, in the Portuguese colony of Mozambique. His hopes were ephemeral, as 3 years later he died without ever having returned home. This left the family in a hopeless and desperate situation. Then the unexpected happened. All Egas Moniz's family possessions were sold at public auction. The house was saved at the last minute when Uncle Abbot bought and recovered it for the family. The purchase of the Casa do Marinheiro became such a burden for Uncle Abbot that it was no longer possible to maintain Egas Moniz at the Jesuit school of Saint Fiel in Castelo Branco. It was at this time that the young man changed to a high school in Viseu, the same building in which today is the Grão Vasco Art Museum, where his brother Miguel was studying, and where his uncle lived and gave him much support. It was at this establishment that he finished his high school education. António Egas Moniz went on to Coimbra University, where he obtained first his bachelor's degree, then his medical degree, and a year later, his PhD. He had arrived in the student town of Coimbra on the 12th of October 1891, first living in the students' halls of residence in Arcos de Jardim. From 1891 to 1894, he took his undergraduate medical course at the Faculty of Medicine and Philosophy. Yet again, the young student obtained grades with distinctions. But then he had to decide his next move, and was indecisive about a career in medicine or becoming a high school teacher. On the one hand, he had always had a great fondness and facility for mathematics, and even gave private lessons, but on the other hand, he also had a passion for medicine. To practice medicine implied great initial investment with little guarantee of success, but if he were to follow teaching, he would have immediate success without any real investment. His family in Viseu was decisive in his choice. If Egas Moniz thought that he was inclined to teaching, why not set his sights higher and become a university professor? The idea of becoming a Lente de Medicina, professor of medicine in Coimbra, certainly made him apprehensive. Was he not dreaming of unreachable goals? Upon completing his undergraduate course, he ended up opting for medicine, enrolling in the class of 1894. Thus, without failing a year and achieving progressively high grades, he would go on to pave the way for his future, finishing his bachelor's course in 1899. Tradition holds that in Coimbra all students must have time to party, and for Egas Moniz there was no exception. Along with his young classmates, the young student got lost in the nightlife and traditional guitar playing of Coimbra, where he met the celebrated student singer of fado from Coimbra, Hilario. He would often go to tertulias or gatherings where card games were played and met several future personalities including Sidonio Pais, who would go on to become Lente de Matemática, professor of mathematics, and later President of the Portuguese Republic after a military coup in 1917. He was temporarily to become the president of the Students' Union, but was forced to resign soon after because his medical course required many hours of study and dedication. In the meantime, his brother Miguel, who had been looking for a future following his father to the Portuguese colony of Mozambique, had died in 1895 and was buried in the jungle. Less than 3 years later, Egas Moniz would mourn the death of loved ones yet again in 1898, when his mother died, and was shortly followed by his uncle Abad, his primary mentor concerning his education. Egas Moniz pursued his studies, although he was very sad for his losses. Combined with his grief, his studies were becoming ever more intense, which gave him even more determination, and he graduated in medicine on the 31st of July 1899. He was 25 years old. He presented his thesis in February 1900, entitled Anatomopathological Changes in Diphtheria, where he obtained a grade of 16 out of 20. In July 1901, he presented his PhD thesis, A Vida Sexual, the sexual life, the physiological aspects, where he achieved a grade of 17 out of 20. A few days later, at his graduation ceremony, he was awarded his diploma in person by the Dean of the University of Coimbra. In his own words, Egas Moniz is recorded to have said that the subsequent loss of family had left him hopelessly alone. In the same year, he marries Dona Elvira Macedo Dias, who was at the time just 17 years old. She was from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil and daughter of Portuguese immigrants. She had come to study in Portugal and decided not to return to Brazil, taking up residence in Lobão, in the district of Viseu. This marriage did not bear children. In 1902, Egas Moniz became professor at the Faculty of Medicine in the University of Coimbra, after contesting for Lente, professor of the Faculty of Medicine, with the second volume of his work, A Vida Sexual, this time concerning the pathological aspects of sex life. He wasn't entirely satisfied with the result. There were 2 types of vacancy on offer, 2 vacancies for catedrático full professors, which was the highest level, and 3 vacancies for substitute professor. Egas Moniz was given a position as substitute professor. University rules implied that substitute professors were required to teach a variety of subjects of medicine whenever required, which meant that he was to teach anatomy and histology as well as general pathology. It must be admitted that this second-best position was not to his liking, explaining his weakened interest in teaching. For some time, Coimbra was becoming very small for Egas Moniz's ambitions. In the beginning of January 1900, within months of finishing his course, he ran for office as deputy for the Portuguese Parliament, taking his seat in São Bento Palace in Lisbon with the Progressista Party, inspired by his great friend José de Alpoim. In a first mandate, he was elected by the district of Viseu, and after in Estereja, his home district. He would sit on the benches for diverse legislatures, throughout the transitional period from the fall of the monarchy to the implementation of the First Republic and its troubled times until 1918. In Lisbon, he met up with his old friend from the times of Coimbra, Sidónio Paes, who was also a deputy and later to become Minister of Development for the first constitutional government. From this time on, his attentions were divided between two towns, Lisbon and Coimbra, which wasn't easy at a time when transport was somewhat limited. Probably due to this, he began to spend more time in Lisbon than in Coimbra. He opened a surgery in the capital, and from the summer of 1902, Egas Moniz began to visit neurological and psychiatric clinics in France, dedicating the first year to psychiatry in Bordeaux with professors Albert Pitre and Régy. Next year, he began his annual summer visits to Paris to the famous Hôpital de la Salpêtrière, with the aim of specializing in clinical neurology. There he met the big names in neurology, given that Paris, and particularly Salpêtrière, was the center of world neurology. Among other shining figures appeared Joseph Babanski, who remained his friend throughout his life. Even as a student, Egas Moniz held strong political convictions. He defended freedom of speech and free thinking, considering this as fundamental for social progress. But his convictions would take their consequences. On the 28th of January 1908, he was arrested in Lisbon, involved in an attempted coup to overthrow the government of the dictatorial Prime Minister João Franco. He was detained at the police station of the Municipal Guard and was only released some days after the assassination of the king, under proclamation and appeasement promoted by the recently crowned surviving prince. Egas Moniz dedicated himself to medicine, politics and the faculty. Even so, he still found the time for writing. Literary publication was ever constant throughout his life, having an extensive bibliography of more than 300 titles. From simple scientific articles to, for example, the biography of the Portuguese 19th century romantic writer Júlio Diniz in 2 volumes. In 1910 he became full professor in Coimbra. However, he did not actually get to take up the position, as in October of the same year was the implementation of the Republic. In February of the following year, 1911, the universities of Lisbon and Porto were created. In Lisbon, 2 specific chairs were created, in which Gama Pinto was to preside over ophthalmology and Egas Moniz to preside over neurology. He thus obtained a transfer from Coimbra to Lisbon, once and for all cutting all his professional ties with Coimbra, where he only returned as a visitor. Not without difficulty, he continued his political activity, at that time belonging to the Portuguese Republican Party, also professor at the new University of Lisbon, as well as his surgery at the exclusive street of Rua do Alecrim. But also he continued his seasonal holidays in France, never forgetting his beloved homeland of Avanca. In April 1912 he resigned as political deputy, returning to the faculty in Lisbon, dedicating himself to teaching and the service of neurology at Santa Marta School Hospital. However, his political involvement did not end there. He remained quite active. In December 1916 he was arrested, now for the second time, spending some days alongside the river Tejo aboard the San Gabriel warship. He was accused of conspiring against the government by being part of what was known as the Sacred Union, led by Bernardino Machado. It was the middle of the First World War. After experiencing a bitter feeling of injustice, he did what any conspirator would do and returned to active politics, creating the National Republican Party. The objective was to unite the trend of ex-monarchists and republicans who had distanced themselves from the Evolutionist Party. Egas Moniz defended the alliance between capital and labor, because in his mind it was necessary to narrow the conflict between the bourgeois and labor workers. The presentation of his new party program was on the 20th of July 1917, introducing legislation for employment as well as technical and sexual education. With the coup by Sidonio Pais on the 5th of December 1917, his friend from the times back in Coimbra, people started again to talk about Egas Moniz. At first he refused the invitation of Sidonio Pais to join the coup, but in March 1918 he finally gave in to the incessant appeals of his friend, accepting that his small National Republican Party serve as the parliamentary base for Sidonismo, the new regime. He himself was constituted as leader of the parliamentary majority, and at the same time accepted the ambassadorship in Spain to the court of Alfonso XIII. This post required great diplomacy as monarchist Spain looked with great apprehension at the tumultuous Portuguese Republic. Through this diplomatic post, he achieved closer proximity to the Vatican through the nuncio envoy in Madrid, which would culminate the re-establishment of relations with the Vatican, which had been compromised from the start of the Republic in Portugal as a result of the anti-clerical attitudes of the time. In 1918 he became Minister of Foreign Affairs. In this position he presided over the Portuguese delegation at the Versailles Peace Conference. 1 month later, on the 15th of December 1918, Sidonio Pais was assassinated at Rossio railway station in Lisbon, a political event which provoked the strongest of emotions. This came as a shock to Egas Moniz, still at the conference. In Lisbon, successive governments followed in quick succession. However, curiously, his position as foreign minister was somewhat symbolically maintained. In fact, he was quite disconnected from the political turbulence in Lisbon. This leads him to ponder his position. He then decides to ask to be relieved of his ministerial position, returning to Lisbon and leaving politics for good, dedicating himself body and soul to medicine. This last incursion into politics was the subject of a book he published in 1919, which he called A Year in Politics, as exactly 12 months had passed since the start of his collaboration with Sidonio Pais, and his exit from politics soon after the Versailles Conference. He finally leaves politics for medicine, for good. He involves himself in scientific research, but in parallel maintains his post as professor, which was an important complement to his life. In his opinion, a professor should undertake his own research as a way of making a personal contribution to the advancement of science. There is no spiritual pleasure like that which one experiences as when one makes a new scientific discovery. The greatest of pleasure, the greatest happiness. We live internally in that jubilee, unlimited jubilee, and the reason is simple. It is that a sense of work on the human brain rises very high, so high that one enters into communion with the gods. He became the first professor of neurology in Portugal, and with him, service at Santa Marta School Hospital, in which, as a result of progress in angiography, the first neurosurgery section was developed. Our investigator was confronted with an important problem for neurology of the time: the identification of tumors. As there were no methods of adequate imaging, we were a long way away from the CT scan, and even further from today's magnetic resonance. He had the idea that with a contrast material which would make the blood vessels in the brain opaque, that could then be visualized by X-ray to identify distortions in those vessels, which indirectly helped to detect intracranial tumors. He therefore started to test various products for a contrast to be injected, so as to visualize the blood circulation of the brain, starting on cadavers and then on dogs, until he had obtained a visible solution on X-ray, which simultaneously would not cause damage. But at the time there were immense difficulties and the hospitals were rudimentarily equipped, even for that time. Despite this, Egas Moniz did not give up. He decided to overcome the difficulties by soliciting the help of the radiology service at the Institute of Anatomy and the Rocha de Cabral Institute in Lisbon, with a view to obtaining cadaver heads for his experiments. The heads were transported somewhat clandestinely in the boot of his Cadillac Strapontin, with folding seats. In order to keep up with his work, he counted on regular contact with French doctors, but above all, he depended on his most direct Portuguese colleagues. Pereira Caldas, Cancela de Abreu, António Martins, Eduardo Coelho, António Flores, Almeida Lima, and others. His work was crowned with success, being responsible for one of the most remarkable discoveries of the 20th century. It was the 28th of June 1927, and Egas Moniz had just obtained the first angiography of a patient suffering from a brain tumor in the pituitary region. The opacity obtained with an injection of a contrast material enabled the X-ray visualization of blood vessels in the brain, and through the alterations observed, obtained the location and even in some cases identified the type of expansion lesion, allowing choice as to the most adequate treatment. Thus was born the discipline of brain angiography, creating an important means of diagnosis above all for tumors, aneurysms, vascular malformations, intracranial hematomas, vascular occlusions, dissections and other causes of vascular pathology of the brain. As soon as he obtained his first results, Egas Moniz traveled to Paris, where he presented his discovery to his colleagues of the Neurology Society, Société Neurologique. But Egas Moniz's research did not end here. Brain angiography additionally opened the way to the original objective, in that the actual blood vessels were the object of research, and not just a means of identifying tumors. His work received the most rave reviews, being encouraged to carry on, recommendations which in fact he did not disregard. In 1931, in Paris, the prestigious Maison Publishers edited the first book on the subject of angiography, prefaced by Dr. Joseph Babansky. Diagnostics of Brain Tumors and Proof of Arterial Encephalography. 3 years later, in 1934, another volume was published, Brain Angiography, the Physiological Clinical Applications and Results in Anatomy. The discovery of brain angiography was from the very beginning subject to applications for the Nobel Prize. One was in 1928 by his colleagues, professors of the Faculty of Medicine of Lisbon, Betancourt Raposo and Azevedo Neves, and the other in 1933 by Jaime Salazar Souza and Lopo de Carvalho. Both were rejected due to the still very small number of case studies. But the innovative thinking of Egas Moniz did not stop here. From 1935, he dedicated himself to another area, the surgical treatment of certain psychiatric conditions. In fact, he believed it was possible to obtain important results by using surgical methods to treat such patients by the cutting of brain fibers. An intervention which, in his opinion, should be performed in the prefrontal lobes. At the time, there were no effective medication developed for the treatment of mental conditions. Patients with mental conditions who were aggressive were very often confined to psychiatric hospitals for their entire life. The idea of Egas Moniz was that by cutting the said nerve fibers in the frontal lobe, one would obtain a calming effect on such patients. It had previously been observed that incidents which provoke damage to this region of the brain often resulted in vast alterations in behavior. During this time, Egas Moniz attended a scientific presentation at the International Congress of Neurology held in London in 1935, where there were reports of cases of induced calming effects in chimpanzees, Lucy and Becky. Egas Moniz immediately adapted the procedure to humans, which later on resulted in much criticism. But the future Nobel Prize for Medicine winner opted for this, arguing that it was not possible to adequately test it on animals, as at the time there were no known psychiatric conditions identified in chimpanzees. He initially used a method which consisted of the introduction of pure ethanol, but quickly abandoned it due to the disappointing results obtained. He therefore used a special instrument which he called a leucotomo. It consisted of a hollow needle with an internal blade, with which was introduced through a small hole in the cranium into the white substance of the frontal lobe, permitting the removal of the blade to form an arc. The rotation of the instrument would cut a small sphere 1 centimeter in diameter into the white substance. Closing the arc, the needle is removed without causing any further damage to the cortex, unlike with a common exploratory intervention. In this way, the prefrontal leucotomy was developed. However, such procedures were never performed by Egas Moniz, as he lacked surgical experience, but by his collaborator, neurosurgeon Almeida Lima. After obtaining results in 1936, Egas Moniz publishes, again with the publisher Maison of Paris, the work Surgical Attempts in the Treatment of Certain Psychosis. This work evoked much interest in many countries, especially in the USA, after its adoption by the neurologist Walter Freeman and neurosurgeon James Watts from the University of Washington, D.C. On the 14th of March 1940, at 64 years of age, Egas Moniz suffered an attempt on his life. A psychiatric patient, whom he had previously recommended to take a rest period outside Lisbon, returned to Lisbon unexpectedly, with a delirious idea that Egas Moniz was allied with his family to not treat him adequately. He fired 8 bullets at the doctor, 6 of which hit him in his right hand and various other parts of the thorax and spine. He was admitted into São José Hospital in a critical state. He had 3 bullets removed, and another was to remain lodged in his spine for the rest of his life. This attempt on his life generated huge sympathy in the country, including the interest of political power, led by Salazar, who had no sympathy for our professor owing to his previous political career. Meanwhile, angiography was to become recognized and used internationally, which was to win him the Oslo Prize in 1945 by that Norwegian university. The good results of his work again raised interest in his nomination for a Nobel Prize. Thus, in January 1944, a new proposal focused on leucotomy for a Nobel Prize was put forward by Freeman. But yet again, the coveted prize was not awarded. Time did not stand still. Egas Moniz reached the age of 70 in 1944, and thereby his retirement. He was succeeded by Professor António Flores. But the active life of the now retired professor didn't stop there, with the continuation of his literary activities and his involvement in the Lisbon Academy of Sciences, of which he was numerous times president. In August 1948, again by proposal from Freeman, the first International Congress of Psychosurgery was held in Lisbon, which, in addition to speeding up the flow of information of the subject, was also aimed to honor the now elderly Portuguese professor of neurology. The Congress was a great success, and delegates from various countries were present. the Brazilian delegation decided to present a motion to propose Egas Moniz for the Nobel Prize for Medicine, which immediately got the support of the other delegations present, and was later formally presented to the Swedish Academy. Finally, on the 27th of October 1949, the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine was awarded to Egas Moniz, shared with Rudolf Hess, the Swiss scientist dedicated to neuropsychology. The Portuguese laureate thus became the only Portuguese to be awarded the Nobel Prize for Medicine and Physiology. The reporter to the Nobel Foundation who considered the proposal, Olaf Kroner, noted that leucotomy had been used in more than 10,000 cases in the world, thereby proving the use of the process for pain relief in normal people, and that the leucotomy was a great therapeutic advance, being no doubt as to its originality. Another conclusion was that a large number of patients suffering from psychosis could be rehabilitated. Due to his poor health, Egas Moniz did not go to Stockholm. The prize ended up being presented to him by the Swedish ambassador to Portugal at the home of the Portuguese doctor in January 1950. Recognition was extended throughout the country. Egas Moniz did not consider himself to be a man of words. Even so, he dedicated himself to literature during rest periods. He enjoyed gardening, and he was an admirer of nature. He loved his village. His holidays were almost always split between the thermal baths, so popular at the time, and Avanca. He even confessed jokingly that of all the places he knew in the world, his favorite was Paris, immediately after Avanca, of course. However, he did not disregard more mundane tastes. He was a social person. His receptions at his home became famous. He liked to go to bullfights, accompanied roller hockey games and football on the radio, was an honorary member of Benfica Football Club, and was a natural card player, in particular of Boston and Volterette, styles which were a family inheritance. He liked to get together with his friends on Fridays, which was little more than a refuge from his professional life. He collected stamps, paintings mainly of Portuguese naturalists, India Company and Canton porcelain, as well as old Portuguese sureties. The Portuguese doctor managed to collect rare and beautiful prints, engravings, sculptures, jewellery, tapestries, and a most notable cutlery set, which had belonged to the 18th century Marquis of Pombal. He held the most varied positions in vast areas: correspondent member of the Neurological Society of Paris, President of the Academy of Sciences of Lisbon, member of the Literary Academy of Brazilian Literature, and many others. He received many honorary distinctions, including the Legion d'Honneur of France, and many other foreign distinctions. In a disenchanted comment in the last years of his life, he said, "I've received many honors and decorations, one of which by the hand of a Portuguese minister of the Salazar regime, a serious and honest person who did what he could. I would willingly exchange them for the improvement and development to my department at the old Santa Marta School Hospital." In his extensive literary work, he left more than 300 titles as sole author or jointly with others, amongst which some of the most relevant are Neurology and War, 1918, the biography of the Portuguese writer Júlio Diniz, Our Home, a biographical scope of his family, Father Freire and the History of Hypnotism, Confidences of a Scientific Investigator, a biographic view of his professional life, etc. Egas Moniz passed away unexpectedly in Lisbon on the 13th of December 1955, at the age of 81, and was buried in his hometown. As he was not well thought of by the Salazar dictatorship, the funeral was followed by his closer friends with some apprehension. His wife, Elvira, wished to perpetuate his memory and founded the Egas Moniz Foundation, which years later gave rise to the present Egas Moniz House Museum in Avanca. His widow, Elvira, died some 10 years later and was buried next to her husband at the Ivanka Cemetery. The house museum is the family residence by inheritance which Egas Moniz had rebuilt in 1915. In this museum, we can appreciate the objects which at one time had belonged to Egas Moniz, and in the library, we can see the works read and written by the doctor himself. In the various rooms, it is also possible to soak up the atmosphere from the times afar when long social evenings occurred and great thoughts were churned over. A man's name does not die when his name is connected to the great discoveries of humanity. In fact, his name continues to be remembered throughout the world every time a brain angiography is undertaken, whatever technical variation is used. In Portugal, at his medical faculty, it is impossible to forget him. His name echoes in various places, and his example remains alive to those who follow neurology.